Hey guys, it's Crossroads here. Today I wanted to talk about HIMS. Specifically, I have a video addressing why it fell on Friday. One of those big pieces of news was that the FDA shortage list has shown semaglutide, which HIMS has compounded for a while now, is no longer on the shortage list. What does this mean? Well, some take it to mean that HIMS can no longer compound semaglutide at all. There's a few things that are wrong with that. But what I want to talk about mostly is how much and under what conditions can HIMS actually be able to continue to compound semaglutide, this GLP-1 that they have. So first, you need to know the 503B and 503A are two different types of compounding facilities and exceptions that the FDA allows for you to basically use a copy of a drug that's a private property of another company, and you're able to mass market it. Now, one of those is, of course, if a drug is on the shortage list, which means that there's just not enough of it. And so they say, hey, let's ramp this and get it out to people that can help as quickly as possible. And here, of course, it's removed now. And so I believe that they have 90 days. It might be 120 days. Doesn't matter too much, just to ensure that there's no disruption in supply. Now, there is a 503A exception. And I looked at a couple of FDA documents. I want to show you two just so you can find them yourself. One is pharmacy compounding of human drug products under Section 503A of the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act. This is guidance. And they say all over it, by the way, that it's guidance, non-binding recommendations. All that's to say there's probably going to be a lawsuit at some point, and this is very ambiguous. And then the other part is prescription requirement under Section 503A of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. These are actually fairly short documents. They're not that hard to read. And so I encourage you, if you're a HIMS investor, to actually look them up, look at them yourself. They're not that hard to understand. So basically, you have a few exceptions for 503A. 503A is basically what's considered the clinical necessary exception. And so a physician, for instance, can have a patient that comes in for any kind of drug, and the physician or the person might be allergic to a certain kind of dye, or that they just can't swallow pills. And so a physician that already has an established relationship with that consumer can say, okay, tell you what, I can go ahead and make some supply for you. You're not going to have to take it the more expensive way, but instead they can offer this compound instead. Now, HIMS, of course, does use physicians to be able to write these prescriptions. And so they kind of get around that. They especially do because the FDA deems that the establishment of that relationship is if a pharmacy or a pharmacist compounds at all, like once for a consumer, all of a sudden they're under this established relationship exception. And so if it's deemed as clinically necessary, which is also not well defined by the FDA, but if they say, hey, you know, they have an allergic reaction to it, or MedMatch, or even our new acquisition, which is the blood test kits that are at home, shows that this person really does benefit from a more specific dosage. They've also mentioned age, and maturity rather, and also weight. They could say, hey, our drug is actually more effective, therefore it's clinically necessary. Now, I don't know if that argument will fly or not, but that's what the 503A exception is. And it seems like the CEO is indicating this by some of the verbiage he mentioned last quarter. We knew that this shortage listing would end eventually, and also by some of his comments on Twitter over this weekend. He is indeed going for that clinically necessary argument. And so my guess for what happens is essentially that HIMS announces this and talks about this in the earnings call, where they say we still will compound for those that we deem that is clinically necessary for, and that they will argue that their personalization is not just a carbon copy of a drug, but actually benefits the end consumer. And so they'll continue to do this, and they will get some pushback. And the biggest pushback is, of course, from Novo Nordisk. Novo Nordisk actually called them out. And this is one of those articles that was written. They had a response to the Super Bowl ad, and they called it reckless and dangerous. And one of those things that they ran too, they have this ad, do you really know what you're injecting in your body? And they talk about it being dangerous if it's something that was not compounded by them. And this is one of those FDA exceptions, that if the FDA does rule that this specific type of compounding is not being done properly, whether it's a violation just because of sanitary and regulatory concerns, but even more likely just because it's a difficult thing to do and get right and it causes adverse side effects, the FDA can actually put this on a list where it can no longer be compounded at all, period. And that's going to be the argument that Novo Nordisk mostly tries to make. Now, there's a couple of other things that they're also going to try to argue. Another thing that they're going to argue is they'll say that this 503A exception is not meant to be used on this large of a scale. My guess is that HIMS is going to try to shift most of their current GLP-1 users over to some level of personalization and be able to skirt through that 503A exception. And probably a lot of their consumers will end up doing that simply because it's probably going to mean a cheaper price for them. So some, of course, through natural attrition will stop using the product. Others will go and get it from the legitimate place that's manufacturing it, Novo Nordisk, through their pharmacy. And perhaps there's some insurance reasons for that as well. But my guess is that HIMS will still very much benefit from this. So they're going to argue and say that this loophole, 503A loophole, was not designed for this at all, that it's, of course, dangerous, that these are just essentially copies, that personalization doesn't really give anything extra to the actual end consumer. And I think that they might have a point on that. My guess is that HIMS will find a lot of clinically necessary exceptions, and that years later, perhaps a court looking at this says, some of those, yeah, you had a point, and others, not so much. Let's define this for you. And it may end up to be a fine and also a restriction of what they can and cannot put to 503A. Now, the harder part of this, too, for HIMS is that beyond that established relationship, you might be saying, well, what about new clients, new people that want to use HIMS? Are they able to offer GLP-1s to them? Well, for the next few months, they are. But after that, the argument and what the FDA requires is compounding after a valid prescription that shows that they have this clinically necessary condition that lets them compound this for the end user. HIMS will say that they have physicians that meet with these people on the front end, even without that established relationship, which is fine by FDA regulations. What's harder is for them to prove that clinically necessary element. And we'll have to see, but I think this is one of the reasons why HIMS actually acquired this company, Sigmund, New Jersey. Let me pull this up. This is actually kind of interesting. Seems like a big deal, right? The press release. And I think it is. I think this is a nice, credible piece, not high margin, but it builds that thesis that they're able to offer something that's much more personalized and benefits that end user. Why was the timing of this? I think that the CEO of HIMS probably knew that this end of the shortage list was coming. And as a result, maybe they were in talks with these guys, but ultimately they just decided to acquire them. So they can argue that they acquired this not for that 503A loophole, but instead for an extra level of personalization. This is all speculation, by the way, and I'm a HIMS shareholder. But they're going to say that this Tri Labs was bought for that, not to try to skirt the 503A. Probably not true. This is a very, very small company. I believe it has less than a dozen employees. They don't have massive scale. Now, I do think HIMS will absolutely integrate this well into their system. They'll actually leverage this in a number of ways across their ecosystem. It's not just for 503A, but the timing, it's a little bit suspicious. One other thing that I'll mention as well is liraglutide, which is the generic version of semaglutide, is something that HIMS will be able to offer. Plus, they have their own weight loss products. They have their nutrition line as well, and a lot more things that are not yet released. So I expect that they'll also try to leverage people into those products as well. Now, so to sum up, what do I think is going to happen? Well, I think that HIMS is going to make this announcement, say that they're trying to shift the bulk of that volume through 503A and also onboard existing clients, or new clients rather, which I think will prove a little bit harder than they anticipate and a little bit more costly as well. But we will see that GLP-1 revenue will not disappear overnight. It may slowly decline. It may slowly increase. It's not going to be this torrid pace that we saw previously, but HIMS is still okay with it. I also think that Novo Nordisk is going to file a lawsuit maybe even mid-part or late into this week. They're probably already preparing to do so just because they disagree with HIMS rationale with 503A. They don't want someone else making their product, especially now that it's no longer on the shortage list. I do think that HIMS will actually be able to shift the bulk of a lot of that GLP-1 onto their 503A exception, at least for a little while. They're going to argue that MetaMatch and Tri Labs actually help them be able to determine what is clinically necessary. They're going to say that that's very, very broad. And so as a result, years later, I think that there will be additional clearance on that. But for now, I think HIMS is fine. Even without that, the company is fine as well. But I wanted to break down and just share my thoughts on what might be happening come Monday with what the CEO says, and also a little bit further down the road with Novo Nordisk's response. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you think that they'll still be able to offer semaglutide after the time has elapsed for that 503B exception? Do you think they'll actually continue to press the pedal to the metal and actually accelerate the product? I don't, but hey, I'd love to be wrong there. Are you selling HIMS out of this concern because there's just uncertainty around it, or just waiting for earnings? Let me know what you think in the comments. As always, thank you for watching, commenting, and subscribing. For now, happy investing.